Well, now it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, a great friend of Amber and VGA, Joy Jones, the CEO of GMAC. Joy, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you here today. And as always, I am grateful for the opportunity for us to explore ways that we continue to do great work and have an excellence in our commitment to business education. So thank you for welcoming me this morning. I'd also like to, of course, thank Andrew. GMAC has over 70 years of history in supporting business education, and we've appreciated the partnership we've had with AMBA through the years and our ability to continue to explore what's going on in our ecosystem and connecting the dynamics between what you're seeing in your institutions to what we're seeing as we engage candidates who are on this journey. Today, I thought we would share some thoughts that I think actually complement the last two presentations quite nicely. We are going to spend some time talking about the shifts in preference around student mobility and certainly candidate preferences when they're considering business education as a part of their personal journeys. And where we come from in speaking to the pipeline, the promise, and the potential is in our history of supporting candidates and supporting you throughout the journey. Now, we at GMAC have the benefit of having both in-person and online engagement with many, many individuals around the world who are thinking about where their next steps in their career are. And through our engagement with them, it gives us the opportunity to speak both quantitatively and qualitatively about what's persuading them, what's top of mind, where are they thinking that this is going to fit into their personal growth and development. And we also certainly have an opportunity to hear from a number of our member and client schools about what's top of mind for them. And we carry it all the way through to the perspective of corporate recruiters who are looking at your institutions to develop their next set of business leaders. So it's a great platform, which I greatly enjoy, to get engaged and immersed in what are some of the themes that are most meaningful to us and to graduate management education in particular over the next several years. So I will be sharing some insight from some of our research, but also certainly from our engagement with those prospective candidates and with many of the leaders of institutions around the world. So I think that as you've heard and as you know and as you're experiencing, the events of the world are not only affecting, as you heard from the last few panelists, they are affecting institutions for sure, but that also carries forward into a prospective learner's sense of what's needed and what's relevant to them as they make their decisions and how their preferences are continuing to evolve. So I think that, you know, I'm one of the few American speakers, so I want to tell you right now, I am not an expert on Trump. And I wish I had a crystal ball, but I do not have that crystal ball. But I can speak, of course, certainly about what we saw in sentiment as this journey has unfolded. So I'm sure all of you appreciate that during the first Trump administration, yields for the US schools in terms of international students dipped. I will tell you, before the recent elections, the perspective of students was that this might be positive because there would be a pro-business and pro-growth sentiment in the administration. So there was a lot of positivity about that. And there was positive perspective. I was on the ground speaking to students in a number of countries, and particularly, for example, in India, where they felt that the governments had a positive relationship, that might lead to more opportunity. I probably won't surprise you in saying that the sentiment for students has dropped significantly over the last several months as the reality of impact around immigration policy, the perspective on higher education as a whole, and the potential economic environment that is affecting us all has really shifted the sentiment about interest in study in the United States and what that means for student opportunity and career opportunity within the U.S. Yinka spent some time this morning and the first panel giving more insight than I could possibly deliver about the dynamics of currency crisis around the world, but I will say that that is fundamentally one of the things that students most speak to when they're talking about their ability to afford the opportunity to study abroad, as they have expressed the aspirations, but seeing the wealth and the wherewithal and the means and the access to financial aid that they're so reliant on shifting has really called to question about whether or not right now is the right time to study abroad. Of course, you know all about the visa restrictions and the changing dynamics across a number of cities that had been popular in previous years, and these are making the dynamics of which cities that students are interested in studying in a little bit different. I'm sure you're experiencing that certain countries who have been less restrictive, Germany, France, Italy, some of the others who have been much more positive about their interest in seeing students consider them as major hubs for education, are actually seeing the positive effects coming through. But students are telling us that they have lack of clarity or insight about what's happening with visas and when things will continue to change. So all of that dynamic in particular is making a lot of uncertainty about the possibility of pursuing their next step abroad. Now, there's a positive side to that, which I will come to in just a moment, but it's certainly shifting where candidates are considering. And as not surprising to any of you, the benefit of some of the countries that are changing right now was the English language advantage that they had for students who felt that they had English proficiency that they could actually leverage and study in these particular countries that are highlighted here. Of course, we know that if you look at what's happened over the last several years, many schools have been faced with declining enrollment in domestic pipelines. We've seen that certainly in Western countries, but that has evolved certainly in other parts of the world. And one of the things that has helped everyone is the boom in demand from Indian and Chinese candidates. I think Chinese first and Indian candidates more recently. And that, I think, was one of the drivers of a lot of confidence in expanding portfolios and offerings across business schools, because there was significant demand and growing demand from certain parts of the world. Of course, there is, with that opportunity or with that growth in demand, there's a recognition, and I think you've heard, Andrew was just speaking to an example of one of the IIMs, but you do see that there's more quality options for education in those markets and more business schools growing every day, and the perception of quality of your institutions in those geographies. I know there's good representation from Indian and Chinese schools here. There's a lot of interest in studying at home, both because of affordability, as candidates share, but also because of cultural context and the ability to drive connection with emerging industries that are growing in those geographies. So it's creating a shifting dynamic about where the best future opportunity is perceived to be. And finally, just the point that the wars, there are lots of conflicts that are happening around, but I think where candidates are expressing most of their angst is about the uncertainty. So if they make a decision to study, it's a significant investment of their time and their dollars. And the question of whether or not they'll be able to complete the journey and continue to pursue educational opportunities in different parts of the world, or in certain industries that might be disrupted more from an economic or political standpoint because of those conflicts, is really what's causing a sense of question and uncertainty for them. So in this context, I will say that what we are hearing increasingly from students is a potential to defer their consideration, but not eliminate their consideration. There is also certainly a good amount of question and discussion about where does business come into creating the solutions. There was a comment yesterday about the fact that many of our graduates are ones who are involved in the political spectrum, but also that fact that business is playing a huge role and economic factors are playing a huge role in these conflicts themselves, but there's not a huge presence of corporate engagement around solving some of these issues, and certainly a key question among students about where do business schools and where do business leaders and business education fall in this spectrum to help us navigate this future. Now, when we talk about the change that's happening, of course, we try to make sure that we're not talking about it from one particular point of view. While we are headquartered in the United States, our membership is actually 40% international. And so we spend a lot of time with our members who are outside of the U.S., and a lot of their feedback is that this creates opportunity for us. And I'm sure many of you feel like opportunity might be created for you in terms of candidate mobility and student preference going forward. So what are some of the dynamics that we're hearing in our more qualitative conversations with candidates and schools? Well, first of all, the interest in studying in the U.S. is certainly one that's been depressed in recent cycles. I will tell you, though, that many of the leading business schools saw very strong application growth in their round 1 and round 2 applications this year. It's actually the question of yield and the ability of students to get to the U.S. That they're most concerned about. Prospective students have a similar concern, and so when they are looking at their interests, a lot of it is being diverted away from the U.S. and into other countries that based on whether or not they have visa rules that are conducive to their students. And also, when I'm out visiting with our German member schools, for example, they're very excited about some of the reforms they're making in terms of worker and skill initiatives, and also their own ability to introduce programs like language programs that help support candidates that might be seeing or perceiving language as a barrier. It's also interesting that solutions like, I don't know if many of you have seen where there's a highlight that Duolingo with AI was able to introduce over 100 new languages in a matter of weeks for what would have taken years to help with translation. And there's a growing sentiment around young people that language barriers will not be as strong as they have been in past years, which creates new opportunity for people who may not have previously been prepared to study in English language programs, or in German language programs, or in French language programs, or pick your language. So language as a barrier is anticipated to not be insurmountable by the next generation of learners. There, of course, is quite a lot of discussion about the investment in emerging markets, and the current geopolitical climate and economic climate is making it difficult for many students to actually come to study outside of their home country. And so there is more investment in partnership and foreign-friendly visa policies in parts of the Middle East. In fact, when I talk to schools, the Middle East is one of the areas where they're thinking about that more. I think the term that Morris just used was regenerative rather than extractive context in order to meet the needs of more students. And seeing new models of educational partnership emerging in that region is really an area of opportunity which students are finding very compelling, because it gives them exposure to cultures around the world that they may not have otherwise had an opportunity to experience unless they were primarily focused on leaving home. And finally, I'll just say that while we see in Asia shifting dynamics, I think one of the most interesting things is that when I am visiting with schools in India and China, and when I'm visiting with candidates in India and China, as I said, they're thinking of high-quality options in their own region. But I also find interesting that they're very curious about the opportunity for more international candidates to be coming in to their region. Candidates from the U.S. in the past are notorious for not considering studying out of the U.S. Candidates in other parts of Europe, because of the financial opportunities or the lower cost tuition, have good opportunities within the European Union, for example. But Chinese schools are interested in seeing some of those students too. Perhaps not to the numbers in the past, but certainly seeing opportunity for some of their philosophies to be a part of the business education context is of interest and exciting, and it is creating the desire to have more exchanges and opportunities to study in parts of the world that were, again, previously not as accessible for many students from around the world. And I think that extends to study in other parts of Asia. It's one of the certainly the dynamics, a post-COVID dynamic that's continuing to grow as we see student populations in these parts of the world grow. For example, in Vietnam and the Philippines, where they've had a boom in growth of economic growth and opportunity and a high value for education. So we are still seeing those shifts in some of the student pipelines to see those markets emerging and experiencing some growth in demand for study. And it certainly has ebbed and flowed. I think, for example, for Japan, which has been a significant market for executive MBA programs globally, and has had some transition in that priority in recent years. What we are seeing is that there are new measures and government encouragement in some of these countries that's creating visa opportunities, economic opportunities, and access more fully. Of course, there is concern about inflation and commentary about inflation and affordability, and I'll say a little bit about that more going forward. But without a doubt, it's evident that the financial considerations for students are becoming one of the strongest and most compelling reasons for why they consider studying where they're going, where they finally choose to study. It's interesting because it's no longer just about the rankings as a priority for consideration. In fact, if you look at our prospective student survey for 2025, you would see 3 of the top 4 considerations are financial. And increasingly, that identification of the return on investment shows as one of the largest growing considerations, having grown more than 10 basis points in terms of its importance. That is not to suggest that other areas are not important, but what I do find most interesting is that it's pulling away from the idea of just rankings. So when students are looking at whether or not they should take it for granted that every school has an equitable value proposition, they're certainly not perceiving it that way, and they're not perceiving that the rankings authorities are the ones who can best tell them whether or not they're going to have not just short-term career placement, but increasingly the long-term career support that they perceive they need to have made the investment worthwhile. So that's just a little bit of more qualitative comment. I do want to get into a little bit more of the specific data from some of our more recent research programs. So we do an application trends study that comes out in the fall of each year, and we also do prospective students, as I mentioned. But did want to just talk about the fact that in our application trends survey, our most recent one, we are seeing the emphasis around some of the demographic shifts, which are calling for some new approaches in business. So Most programs have expressed that they're seeing variation. That's not trending consistently in more recent years. But in the last cycle, we did see that 32% of programs talked about the year-over-year growth in their domestic applications. And this goes to the point that the most popular format does still continue to be the full-time programs and in-person programs. We have seen the shifts in our application trends over the last few years to go from the 2-year format to the 1-year format. We have seen a return of strength of some of the 1-year formats in certain, not just in the MBA programs, but also in some of the more stalwart or mainstay master's programs, such as master's in accounting and master's in finance, and that's pulled back from programs such as master's in analytics and master's in marketing. So we do see that growth, and I think that that is trending with the fact that there was a question yesterday about is the pipeline getting older or younger, and I will say the pipeline is getting slightly younger across programs. And so, we expect that some of that year-over-year growth in domestic applications will continue to be strong in various parts of the portfolio. At the same time, we know that the demographic shifts are also affecting the age of what you should anticipate and the location of future candidate flows. So we talk about the fact that in Germany, there's going to be about 7% growth over the long haul, and it depends on whether or not you take a long view on what's happening with candidate pipelines, but we do see that Germany, unlike some of the other European countries, will have population growth in its 18-year-olds, and that leads to opportunity. I would also say that if you look over at the growth of people from the 18 to 44-year-old perspective, we know that there's going to be growth further still. So a lot of the opportunity to reach candidates will not just be in that younger population, but in that older population of learners. And in our research, what we find is many of those older learners did not take the opportunity during the last series of, economically strong times to go back and get any kind of educational footprint. In fact, that's where you see a lot of the demand for the micro-credentials and shorter programs coming through. At the same time, we can't ignore the fact that we're expecting significant demographic shift and growth in countries like Africa and other parts of the emerging market, where the numbers by far dwarf and where we know that some of the questions of affordability become strongest. And so, and in our work, we also see preparedness for study having just a different trajectory than what we might have seen in some of our other pipelines. So the question really is, how do we reach and engage with these emerging candidates who often spend much of their time trying to understand where the best opportunity to study is, where the financial opportunity or means to support their study is coming from, and certainly whether or not they're going to have long-term opportunity for career growth in a location or in multiple locations based on the networks of those institutions. And when we talk about, just briefly about what students and employers are saying about what they want to learn and how they want to learn, we do see that, overall, there's a healthy demand for the important and critical skills that business schools are imparting in their graduates. So I will say that from a global or from a Western European perspective, as many of you are from Europe, but not exclusively, but I think in our global data, what we see consistently is that what business skills are doing in terms of imparting things like strategic thinking and problem solving are perceived by most to be more important than they ever were before. It's interesting to note that while some of our younger learners are presumptive about AI being a part of their professional growth and their professional journey, older learners perceive that new technologies are something that will help them have durability and mainstay in their careers in their advanced years, because they're recognizing that they came of age in a business environment that wasn't infused with AI. And so you do see difference in expectations or desires based on the age of different learner populations. But most of the question about AI and technology is not, interestingly, about are you personalizing my learning journey. In fact, that comes very low in our research about the utility of AI, and much more about how are you preparing me to be more of a strategic thinker and someone who who's able to use AI in new ways to develop new innovations. At the same time, most people in the corporate side of our research cite the fact that we don't really want you, business schools, to create technologists. We want you to create people who have that ability to navigate that intersection between human skills and technological skills. So that empathetic leadership to what is being a capable business person going to look like in the future, and the ability to be adaptable and coachable as technology innovation affects business, and certainly as workforces continue to be both hybrid and remote in future contexts. So how do you lead organizations in these changing environments? And so I'll just add a couple of points, which is, when students are looking at, or when you're thinking about the diversity of opportunity and who you might engage, what I will say is that flexibility is really creating the opportunity for most business schools today. The flexibility in the portfolio is leading to schools having something to meet the evolving dynamics of different types of learners. So we've seen growth in the last 2 cycles in terms of the candidates globally preferring business master's degrees. That has improved from 31 to 39%. And as I said, the MBA program still continues to be strong, but the business masters and the spectrum of business masters, and the way that business masters pull in the point about specialization but interdisciplinary connection is really actually increasing its attractiveness to prospective students. At the same time, as we've said, that full-time in-person learning has grown in importance, and that's, I think, a dynamic of post-COVID interest in being in person, and a recognition that work itself is moving back to an in-person format. So we've seen statistically significant growth there as well. And then finally, I would say that, when we look at some of the other formats. So we talk about part-time and online formats. That, as rightly pointed out, has decreased in its popularity. But I would just call out that the part-time and flexible programs have become increasingly attractive to female populations. So when you think about some of the objectives that graduate management education has had for a long time to increase its female pipeline, one of the considerations you may have is keeping that aspect in your portfolio and about who you actually try to market and target with those offerings, because that flexibility has allowed you to meet those particular candidates where they are in terms of life stage and opportunity. And I will say that the trust that learners have in your institutions, and particularly in accredited institutions, is very high. And that's even in competition with other platforms for micro-credentials and other types of learning. But the perspective that you are bringing through your commitments and what you describe in terms of the quality investment you make in faculty and staff and in your partner relationships means that you're more trusted as brands than some of these other platforms. And it's an opportunity for you and your institutions to continue to grow. And as I say, these are just some examples of ways that your portfolio is meeting different types of learners at different life stages. So if I could, just briefly, I'm going to ask one question, or actually pose a couple of questions, and then I'll take questions. So I think that what we've highlighted really, and very briefly, as I know we're moving quickly in these presentations, that there are opportunities for new markets and shifting dynamics. There's growth in different places in your outreach and opportunity. It does require investment on the part of schools. There's interest in new modalities, and again, those different modalities may be serving different segments within the prospective candidate pipeline. And we didn't talk a lot about new partnerships, but as I say, that idea of who you work with in emerging parts of the world or new markets where there's growing interest in graduate management education, but perhaps not the means at this point in time to study abroad, where you might be leveraging and investing in long-term partnerships. Because, again, the corporate perspective and the student perspective on skill development is that graduate and management education and business education is creating skill sets that are critically important for the future success and the impact on some of the societal issues that we've seen before. So I'd ask you to think about where, if you could only make one investment this year, where it would be and what you would be prioritizing. And then finally, I'll just frame, there are a number of questions for us, and if you have an opportunity, there's much more research detail if you speak to some of my colleagues who are also here at the conference, and if you engage with a lot of the other research that GMAC does longitudinally. Many of our reports have gone for 15 years or more, so it gives the opportunity to see those transition and inflection points as they're happening. But I think it will all tee up, if you have a chance to engage with it, questions for the years to come. So when we talk about, are we meeting the candidate needs, I would like to encourage you to think of the new global candidate. Where are they coming from? Who are they? And what are they hoping to accomplish? Are we connecting them with the right skills and resources? Again, business sitting in the context of a very disrupted geopolitical and economic climate and environment, and the expectation that business is a part of the solution and a critical part of the conversation. How can we remain globally relevant? There is certainly a sentiment towards regionalization, but obviously each region is still very much impacting the others. And so while that might mean that in the near term there's a decrease in mobility, it does not mean that there's less of an appetite from a learner perspective to understand that global context. So how do we continue to bring that forward, both with our domestic student pipelines and also engagement with our international partners in international student pipelines. And finally, I will just say, we continue to invest in, and hope that you are too, in thinking about innovative ways to engage prospective learners and to deliver on the kind of lifelong results that they're expecting to have out of having invested in their education. So, with those thoughts, any questions?
Thank you. Wojtek from Prague again. What I read and what you mentioned seemed to me quite positive in general, that people are willing to attend universities across the globe and so on, which is, in my view, a little bit to the contrary to some questions or fears whether MBA as type of education is valid anymore. What's your opinion on this? Where do you think the world of MBA school is going to? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, so I believe actually if you look at the demand for business education globally, we actually do see positive signs in terms of overall demand. The perspective that business education imparts certain skills or knowledge that is still commanding somewhat of a premium depending on part of the world, certainly holds true to a promise of career advancement and opportunity that you may not be seeing through other disciplines. I also, though, do believe that, having that interdisciplinary approach gives credence to the fact that business is a part of every industry. even scientific fields or technological fields, healthcare, et cetera. And so because of that, I think the demand for business education will continue to be strong, but you will maximize your opportunity with future learners if you can build that intersection a little bit more directly so that business doesn't stand apart from other areas of impact. Most of the research we do supports the idea that candidates are looking for that intersection of skills, not the generalist, I think, concept that was being referred to yesterday, but being broad in terms of leadership, affinity, and understanding of different disciplinary areas to develop better solutions and impact and outcome. So you are still seeing that students who believe that they can have a strong societal impact through innovation or through business leadership are still finding that this is a path they want to journey. But you may see that some of those students are coming from different parts of the world than they have in the past. And those parts of the world are still actually developing into global players in business in other areas. And so I think it's still considered an attractive path by many. Any other questions?
Thanks, Joy. It's fascinating data and insight. We always talk about candidates. You talk about employers. We never talk about parents. Are parents and their candidate children aligned in what they want?
That's a really good question. So we don't do a lot of direct research with parents. So I'll tell you what prospective learners say about their parents. How about that? I would say that you do see that prospective learners and parents differ in the sense that parents are looking or encouraging some of the more traditional career paths than what students themselves see as opportunities. Where students are parent-funded, you see more of that influence to follow more traditional pathways. But we have seen that over the years, the amount of students who are saying they expect to be parent-funded is actually decreasing. Which means you have more students looking for financial aid and other forms of support, but they're also perhaps looking for other, crafting their own path in terms of what they're studying. That is not to suggest that parents aren't hugely influential. Right after your own websites speaking about your schools, universities, parents and friends still remain the second most valuable resource for influencing students' decisions. So they may have a little bit of difference in dynamics about where the risk and opportunity, and so that return on investment equation may be slightly different for them. But you do see that the influencing factor still causes some students to make decisions that they think are in the best interest of where they see their long-term career growth happening, and they believe the world is changing rapidly. So that latitude of decision making. Great. One last question, and then I know I'm got a flashing red light here.
Thank you very much for very interesting research you shared. From time to time, we hear from the candidates that their workplace, like their companies, are providing very practical education, which is more relevant for them, comparing to the business schools being called as very theoretical. So does your research cover that? What would be the trends in future in terms of our competition with the corporations organizing education at the workplace? Thank you.
It's a good question. Two dynamics that we do see. One is that if you're talking about major firms in professional services like consulting, somewhat in investment banking, et cetera, you are seeing organizations, invest in having their own educational components as part of their career development and progression for their employees. And of course, if they can avoid paying a premium for someone who's gone to a business school and imparted skills that they think that they can impart in their most junior staff more directly, then they are taking that opportunity. I'd also say, some of the learning platforms and AI and learning platforms and the ability to create curriculum or what they perceive as curriculum that's relevant to their employees has increased. So those things do challenge investment in education or graduate education as our area of focus. At the same time, I think the evolution that we're also hearing from many is that you can curate quite a lot of things from LinkedIn and other platforms, but the richness of the knowledge and experience and the resources that business education as a community is able to pull together is stronger than what a lot of companies outside of that upper echelon can really do for themselves. And so in that respect, what we do hear from corporations is a desire to partner more richly with business schools, particularly schools in their region, to make sure that they actually have the right kind of program that doesn't necessarily involve them losing their top talent for a year or two, but thinking more cooperatively. All right. Thank you very much.